Becomes like a fleeting memory. Whatever you grab just turns to dust. Like eye contact with a stranger in a crowded room is a dream begging to reveal. The passing note of a song, the glimmer of the shifting sea.
Rolling in the deep.
Let's do it. Welcome to the shores.
To the shores. I feel like we forgot. Let me take a sip. Last week to notify people that we've changed things up on the shores.
Oh yeah, true.
For the last 3 years, we've been recording once a week from my home studio, audio only. We are now in a professional podcast studio.
Professional.
Yeah.
And we have a professional guy in the house,
that,
David, who's so professional.
Yes. But we're producing video now and using different microphones, so we might sound a little bit different. And also, the podcast for us has been something of like a sacred ritual for 3 years.
Yeah.
And now everything's different. We're in a different space. We're using different equipment. And I kind of felt it last week. Like I didn't feel, usually we sit down on Wednesday nights to do the podcast and we just like sink right into that sort of flow state of conversation. And I struggled a little bit with that last week and we didn't say anything about it. So I wanted to point that out. We also failed to ever say the name of our guest that we had on the podcast.
We did it?
We said his first name.
Oh, yeah.
So check out last week's episode. You can watch it on YouTube or on Spotify now. We had our friend James Jackson Leach with us. Had a great conversation with him. Lots of information about Austin in general.
And so much super fun stuff about his just entrepreneurial spirit, and all the companies started and stuff. That was
a lot about business,
a
lot about Austin. So check that out. And just know that moving forward, if you ever want to watch, you can on YouTube and Spotify.
Yeah.
So that's what we're doing now.
Super cool.
Yeah.
So what?
I feel like I had another correction.
Oh yeah.
Maybe not.
We can correct later.
You can correct later. I guess just to say, bear with us while we get comfortable in the new location, and we hope that I think it's going to be a big improvement. I'm really jazzed about it.
Yeah.
I'm really excited to take this thing to the next level because we put a lot of ourselves into this over the last 3 years, and excited to have a new format to share with people.
Oh, it's been so crazy. When we put this one out on YouTube for the first time, we have like 7 or 8 episodes we tried to film, and I went back to look at how long we've been doing this. September 24th, I believe, of 2018 is when we started.
It's the first episode.
Yeah, which is so crazy.
And for those first 2 years, we only did 3 or 4 episodes a year, I think. I think like it was episode 10 when we started our weekly cadence.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool. I'm proud of us.
Pretty wild.
Yeah. Cool. What should we get into tonight?
Well, I think probably like that paper you've been kind of working on.
Yeah.
Passover, and I think you even read it to me when we were in Big Bend at one time.
Yeah.
I think you shared that with me.
Maybe.
But you've been kind of working on this for a while.
For a while, yeah. If you've been listening to the podcast over the last number of years, you've probably heard me say before that there's been a collection of essays that I've been wanting to write. I think I first sort of said that publicly in 2020.
Yeah.
And it really was only, 3 months ago that I actually started to do that. So maybe like 2 takeaways from that is if there's something you've been putting off that you want to do, it's not too late. Just do it. And don't be ashamed.
There's also something about building up over time too. It's not that you need to come to production immediately.
Right.
It's something about, even with our podcast, it's, we'll try it and we'll do some here and there. And then after a while, you might find some momentum. But it's just about doing the little things first. And I think that's really helpful.
You were saying something to me earlier today about that at some point you just have to put something out. If you're so concerned with the quality of something, that you're not doing anything with it. And it could be, like for me writing, it could be a podcast. It could be something you're improving in your home. I don't know. It could be anything. But if you're too perfectionist about it to the point that, what's that phrase? The good is the enemy of the great. Perfect is the enemy of the good. Yeah. At some point, something has to be given life. Otherwise, it never emerges as real. So
You see this in coffee shops a lot too, where, people look at me today and the things that I'm doing with Medici, and they think, oh, I can never do that. It's like, well, I've been doing this for 17 years.
It's not like you started that
No.
way. Yeah.
And it's like, and I think that's the part that it's hard for people to kind of start something, because they're comparing themselves to something that's been refined over a period of time.
Right.
That whenever they started, it definitely did not look how it looks right now. And I think that can be intimidating for people. My wife, Allison, she does a good job with this, and she does a art journaling sort of workshop, and she really encourages people. It's like, no, this is not about being an artist. This is about, finding something inside you and putting it out on paper. It doesn't really matter what it looks like. And she has a really good way of kind of communicating that I think is very helpful. Sometimes
it's just simply about getting something to move from inside to outside.
Yeah.
And without judgment. Yeah.
Which is hard, because right now we're surrounded with like Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, with all these sort of figures that have spent so many years doing things, and we compare ourselves to such a broader sphere where 30 years ago your sphere of who you compare to was a lot smaller. So
I mean, I've been feeling that really strongly over the last month and a half.
Yeah.
Just I've been the company I was working for up until January kind of crashed and burned, and I've been looking for a new job for a couple of months, and strange time in the economy to be doing that in the jobs market. All that to say, I've had ample time and opportunity to spend way too much time scrolling through Instagram Reels and Twitter and all of that, and I've definitely felt this like dark cloud of negativity, and it was hard for me to identify it at first. And I think I realized that, you're looking at the best of humanity all day long from your couch. At what point do you consciously realize that you're essentially telling yourself all day long that you're shit? You're not producing anything good, and you're watching all the things that are being shouted at you from the sort of perfect representation of everyone else's lives. I think it's really toxic.
It is.
And I think that it took a sustained period of time with not a lot that I had to do for me to really see that.
Interesting.
But yeah, back to this idea of like, just start on something. And you mentioned that you can refine it over time. And that's actually, I think, one of the most satisfying things to do is to actually make something real. Again, it's like, it could be something you're trying to write. It could be a song. It could be a picture or a journal entry or a new habit that you're trying to form or whatever. Do it badly. Then at least it's outside of you, and you can look at it. It can have a name. You can deal with it directly, and you can begin to improve it because you can see what needs improvement rather than everything just being inside of your head and everything's hypothetical. You can't improve something hypothetical. At some point, you have to test it out in reality. And then the cycles of refinement are super satisfying because you see something and then you do something to it, and you either see it get better or see it get worse.
Yeah.
At that point, it's somewhat objective. So put something shitty out into the world, and then be excited to wake up and make it better the next day.
That'd be so much fun to find a way to somehow create something around that idea of putting something shitty into the world and refining and helping people to do that.
I had a friend, and I don't know whether to give him credit for this. I don't know if he started this, but I had a friend who started something called 7 and 7.
Oh, yeah.
You remember that? It's my friend Aaron Ivey. And again, I don't know if he started that, if it was his idea or not.
I think there's a lot of them.
There's a lot of them now.
A lot of different ones, yeah.
But the idea was like, so he's a musician as well, and the idea was let's get a bunch of songwriters to be accountable to one another and to write one song a day for 7 days and then share it with each other. And it doesn't matter. It's like the point is not to write a good song. The point is not to win a Grammy. The point is not to make an album. The point is simply to do something, move something from inside to outside, and then show that to someone else. and it was incredibly fruitful. And I think it's just having the courage to go, okay, I'm going to detach myself from the output of this. It's okay if it's shit. And I have, I think 2 songs that are in my catalog on Spotify now that came out of that process. Yeah.
That's cool. I was about to ask you that.
Yeah.
Anything that...
I mean, I think that's the thing is like good stuff gets made when you're not paying attention. You know, when you're paying attention to something else. It's like almost accidental. It's once in a blue moon that you intentionally make something that's, at least in the arts, I think. It's once in a blue moon that you actually intentionally make something good. Most of the time you're trying to do something else, trying to learn some new technique or trying to master something adjacent to your craft, and all of a sudden you're like, whoa, there's a song just came out. Or I was just trying to scribble to make my pen work on my pad, and I really like the way that looks. That's a painting now. You know,
well, I mean, you just hear these stories all over the place. I mean, something we bring up a lot about comedians, something I've learned and I just so respect about, is that you work with material out in front of people. That's the only way that you get feedback. And they change the jokes by one word or intonation, or, you know, kind of play with it a little bit. And it's refined over like multiple periods of stand-up sessions.
Yeah.
You know, even in this kind of area where something I admire Michael Jordan in is going to baseball. Here I am. Here's Michael Jordan, the best at basketball.
Right.
And he's going to start over in a minor league in baseball. Like that just tells me a lot about that person who can be at the top of that sphere and still go into a beginner mode. And I think that kind of attitude is super helpful for us to always remember that there are things that we might excel in, but we still need to be able to go into other realms as beginners. And I think there's something that's healthy that will also help us in the things that we're really great at, you know?
Well, we've talked about this a lot before, that the better you get at something, the smaller the payoff of improvement is, because skill is an asymptote.
Yeah.
Like as you get better, a 50% gain is measurably less.
Yeah.
So there's an argument to be made that is, if you have the opportunity to be a beginner at something, that's like a massive dopamine opportunity, essentially, because every improvement is going to be astronomical relative to where you started.
Oh, cool. Yeah. I didn't think of it like that. That's true.
I think we've done a really good job of avoiding talking about what we initially set out to talk about here.
Totally. Well, I don't know. You kind of.
It's just also fascinating.
You caught me up. All this is very inspiring because I kind of, even though I've been doing coffee shops for 17 years, there's a lot of things that I don't know, kind of still feel a beginner at.
Yeah.
This is kind of reminding me of those things.
Well, I would say you are blessed then. To have many places in which you're still a beginner.
Well, I think too, just our conversations help me kind of stay kind of grounded in that sort of, you know, you don't know all that you think you know.
Yeah, right.
It's kind of fun. So, but yeah, so you're right. You had something that you're working on that we kind of want to dive into.
To bring this back full circle, I had said that I wanted to write essays 3 months ago. I started a Substack. I've talked about that on the podcast before. So I've been doing that. I've been writing, and I will say it's been hard. I think I've put out actually, well, maybe this is the point I was making earlier. It's like good things happen by accident when you're doing something else. So I've had a lot of things that I've written over the past number of years that I knew I wanted to put out, as well as a bunch of things that I wanted to write that haven't been written yet. So I've been kind of putting the stuff from the past out, and all of that stuff was written sort of by accident. Like there's a lot of poetry on there. Most of that poetry, I didn't like sit down and think, I want to write a poem, and here's a poem. It was more like I was in the middle of journaling, and then something poetic came out. Is an accident. Or there was some stuff that I wrote. There's a piece that I put on there called She Left on a Saturday. I'm actually really proud of it. It's a really beautiful and I think rather heartbreaking piece. It was something that I wrote while I was trying to process the end of my marriage. But again, it was by accident. I wasn't trying to write something. I was trying to do something completely different, and this thing came out. And then there's one piece that I put on there. It's called "We All Carry a Part of Each Other's Story." It's kind of a long title. That was the first thing that I actually sat down and tried to write, and it was incredibly difficult and incredibly frustrating.
Yeah.
And in some sense demoralizing. Like at some point in the middle of that, I was like, this isn't good, and I just want to stop. So all that to say, we are in the middle of what is it? The in between Palm Sunday, Good Friday, and Easter Sunday. And a number of years ago, I wanted to write an essay about Easter. And so that's what we're talking about. Yeah. That's what we started talking about, and we just gave the longest setup in history for talking about. Yeah. So I thought we would, we thought we would just kind of talk through that a little bit tonight, given that it is apropos of the time.
And it's great because you guys get to hear this for the first time too. I think you read this to me before, or at least discussed it. We discussed it a little bit.
We discussed it. I wrote a first draft a number of years ago, and I'm trying to work on finishing that, and I'm going to put that on my Substack before this Easter, so in the next couple of days. Tonight's Wednesday. So I'm not going to read it.
Yeah.
We're just going to talk it through. And I'll just start by, and make this as much of a conversation as possible. This isn't about me sort of telling you what's in my essay. I wanted to write it really because I thought it was a number of years ago, and Easter was coming up, and I just thought about how bizarre Easter as a holiday is. And I was sort of mulling that over in my mind and thinking, it's like for every major holiday, generally you have sort of like a culturally celebrated version of it. You could maybe say a secular version of it. So with Christmas, you have Santa Claus and reindeer and a sleigh, and for Halloween you have trick or treating. But there are generally more sort of religious practice underpinnings for these things. So Christmas is about the birth of Jesus. Halloween is, what is it? All Hallows Eve.
Yeah.
And so you have Easter, and Easter is, on the one hand, we know it is about the resurrection of Christ, but on the sort of secularly celebrated or practiced version of Easter, you have a bunny
laying eggs,
man-sized bunny laying eggs, which are hidden in the yard and contain treasure.
Well,
it's bizarre.
Well, it's kind of adapted to sort of a fertility ritual, ritual aspect of spring, and so you kind of see that with a lot of religions, how they'll adapt sort of other sort of more like, I guess, pagan religions that kind of have to do with fertility and spring and then death and fall and that kind of stuff. So our Christmas tree, and I think the Christmas tree is another fertility thing. I forget that one now, but I used to know that stuff.
But the question is, like, why is it that, for example, Christmas and Halloween, nobody bats an eye? We're like, yeah, maybe it's silly, maybe it's made up or whatever, but it's like, hell yeah, I'm in. But with Easter, it's bizarre. The explanation for it is nonsensical, and yet we just sort of do it.
What do you mean nonsensical? Like how does that?
Well, what does a man-sized bunny laying eggs have to do with fertility? At least I can make a complicated case for why we would have the idea of Santa Claus.
Yeah,
he's giving people gifts. The bunny's not even giving people gifts, and if he is, he's hiding them. It's just strange.
Well, I think probably because bunnies make a lot of bunnies, so they're very fertile.
Because they hump.
They hump a lot, make a lot of bunnies.
Resurrection of Jesus. You know what we should have?
Well, now I feel dumb because I used to actually because that was one thing I studied, was like I looked at one point was how all the mixture of these different holidays kind of blend together and have different layers to them. And that was something that was super fascinating. Like, Jesus wasn't born in December 26th or whatever. That was not. There's a lot more evidence towards that would have been
other dates,
and something like that. So it's really fascinating to see like how culturally we blend things into something to kind of as a day of representation.
Right.
Yeah, I think probably Easter is probably the one that's most, because Passover and the symbolism between Judaism and Christianity, and where that fits and has always fit in the Jewish calendar, is consistent throughout. That's why Easter is on a different maybe calendar year or whatever, but it still fits on the Friday, Saturday, Sunday kind of in Passover time. It coincides a lot with. So anyways,
yeah, I'm not saying that there aren't explanations for this stuff. It just struck me as bizarre, and maybe partly that's like personal to me, because I do know people who legitimately believed in the Easter Bunny when they were kids, just like they believed in Santa. For me, even when I was a kid, like I was like, that's a stupid story.
Really?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Like, had no buy-in to that story. But so anyways, I started thinking about that, and then I started thinking about, okay, well, what is Easter actually? And I grew up in the church. I would say mostly non-denominational, but a little bit in the Baptist church, and spent quite a bit of time from high school till probably my early 20s before I became jaded with that and had no interest in continuing with it. And I was thinking about, okay, well, what is Easter? And I thought, okay, here's another sort of anomaly. Like, I see Easter culturally as anomalous when compared to other holidays. And that was the point I was trying to make.
Okay, gotcha.
But another anomaly is, well, what do I know about Easter? It is the story of Christ dying and being resurrected. And as much time as I've spent in the church, I thought, I have no idea what that means. Like,
that's wild.
It's like, I understand that it was to redeem the world of its sins, but how that would happen, why would the things that happen, like, why would it be necessary for God to become man and to die and resurrect? Like, there's dots that aren't connecting. And I never heard that really pondered or considered deeply in the church. And I think when I was a kid, I think a concept like that was generally kept separate from much deep thinking. It was just sort of, well, no, this is what happens and you need to believe to be redeemed. End of discussion. And I thought, well, that's anomalous. What's actually going on here? And so that's kind of the point that my thinking starts on that. And you say that's surprising. What's your experience with this holiday?
Just more in general that, that we have this sort of experience of a holiday. So there, like, I kind of feel like there's a certain different steps of maturity, and sometimes seen with Christians in particular, and sometimes just in religion, is there's not a kind of a maturing beyond the story that you tell a child,
right?
And I think it's important that we have stories that we can easily communicate to children about simple ideas. Like, you're not going to go explain Nietzsche to an 8-year-old. It's like there's certain things that are acceptable for that age group. And
thus says Zarathustra. Yeah, that's not really a lullaby.
Yeah, I think Elon Musk talks about, like, reading existentialist philosophers and in high school can really mess you up. But then as an older person, you're like, oh, okay, no, I understand the context of all that stuff. You can understand some of the nihilism, some of the
Well, and I actually think that's why the story of Easter, or the story of the resurrection, has been sort of turned into a children's story.
It's helpful.
But not just for children. It's also helpful for adults, because when I really started to think about it, it is a deep, gnarly, disturbing story. It's nasty.
Yeah.
It's not something, and then that seems strange to me too. It's like, when I really think about it, it's a nasty story. Like, if you've seen The Passion of the Christ, that's like the closest depiction to the actual story that I've seen. And yet, how do we represent Easter in culture? It's bunnies, it's chocolates, chicks, pastel colors, bright, shiny, yay. Everybody's wearing their finest Sunday outfit. It's like all sunshine. And there's nothing about that story that's sunshine, except for the end. but then no one ever explains why the end is sunshine.
Well, because in that whole story, I think that's the part that sometimes people will say cliche wise is like the Catholic Church focuses on the death of Jesus, and the Protestant Church focuses mostly on the resurrection of Jesus. Mm-hmm. And they're really like, there's this whole idea that in both of those that kind of give you a lot of insight into humanity. That's really, I think, super, super important. And it's so compact into that sort of, week of Palm Sunday. Here he is being celebrated coming into this city. And by the end of the week, he's being crucified on a cross, mm-hmm. and then, being resurrected. Like, there's so much information compacted in a week that it's almost hard to sort of unravel. And I think that's something that you see elements of this in our history and culture and media too. Like, at one point, someone's being celebrated, and then the next moment they're being crucified, and very few actually resurrect. Very few can come back from that sort of being praised and then being executed, and then coming back and becoming something else and something new. I kind of think of like with cancel culture or something like that, where somebody steps out of line just a little bit or a lot. I mean, there's a whole spectrum here, but how do you come back to that? How do you become reborn from something like that? Or is that something that hangs over your head for the rest of your life? Like, no, you can't come back because of this thing back here. And so you kind of see that in this whole story too, of like, sort of, is like, no, there is forgiveness, and you can resurrect. You can come back into something new, So I think there's so many stories to be told out of that compression of 1 week, Right.
That's a really interesting point. There are a lot of old stories, whether biblical or even like old child's tales, like Hansel and Gretel, or I was blanking on. There's another one I was thinking of, that they are so abstracted, so condensed over telling and retelling and recounting over time, over hundreds, thousands of years, that they do contain, like, if you really ponder them and consider them, they can sort of explode out into the highest reaching envelope. Mm-hmm. Like, they can start to contain everything.
Well, sort of like, because they're so masterful in the archetypes, mm-hmm. and I think the stories that are very masterful in encompassing the archetypes and communicating them in such a way that, and I think that's something you see specifically, like, like Moses. What does he represent? Not only the story, but he also represents something as a figure in this story. And then you have all the way up to Jesus and what he represents and what he symbolizes in this story. But then you start looking at the arc of maybe your lifetime and the things that you experience, because we always hear about it, oh, I'm going through a desert time. Well, the reason why we say that is because it's referring to this whole idea of, specifically, and this is in other cultures too, but, Moses and the Israelites going through the desert for 40 years. There's a cleansing. And so we use these metaphors and we don't really understand. And they're little tiny sound bites, but they actually refer to a lot of really deep stories. And I think that as you're bringing this up with the whole, Easter story, it's starting to it's making me really want to unpack more of what kind of stories are contained in that, like, week long tale.
Well, you said a word that made everything make sense to me, that these stories contain archetypes. Mm-hmm. And I think the idea of archetypes, and specifically reading Eric Neumann's book, The Origins and History of Consciousness, it changed my life and the way that I see things. And I think there's an important point to be made, which is that an archetype is not just like an appealing character. If an archetype shows up in any given story, it's because that's the part of repeated previous stories that has resonated. So when you look at a book, like we're talking about Easter, so let's take the Bible, mm-hmm. that has been around for thousands of years, and then you think about well, how has it been around for thousands of years? Like, we often forget that it was only 40 years ago that we started having anything digital in our lives. For all of the previous thousands of years. And it was only like, what, 300 years ago that we had the printing press?
Yeah.
400 years ago?
Yeah.
For thousands of years before that, everything was copied down by hand or told by mouth. And so when you have stories like the stories that are in the Bible, they are comprised of what people find interesting and what people find worth remembering. And I think an archetype is exactly that. It is something that through the generations, people have found worth remembering and repeating. And why, and so anytime you run across an archetype, I think you have to ask, well, what is in this piece of content, in this story, that has been worth remembering for so long? Because when you see it show up, you might see it in a new piece of writing or a modern piece of art or film or whatever. But the reason you find it meaningful is in large part because it's resonating with something that's been carried down through generations. And so you look at a story like Easter, and I think I wanted to write about it because I just found it fascinating. Like, if you were setting out to write a story about God redeeming the world, you wouldn't write it that way.
Totally.
Like, when you really think about it, the story of Christ is one of the most tragic stories that's ever been told. He, as you said, is celebrated as a king, is betrayed by a friend, is falsely accused and convicted, is mutilated.
Well, also abandoned by his other friends.
Then mutilated and humiliated, and then subjected to what is essentially slow motion torture to the death. It's not only the worst way you can die, crucifixion, which I want to take a second and talk about that. But before the crucifixion, he goes through every social ill, essentially, archetypally, that you could go through. And why would you write it that way? What does that have to do with redemption? Yeah. And that's just the first part. That's just the death part. But let's take a second on the crucifixion, because I was really thinking about this the other day. I don't think that modern church or modern culture really ever takes the time to explain how horrifically, torturously brutal that way of death is. It's, I think, the cruelest way to kill someone. It's hard to think of a crueler way to kill someone than that.
Yeah, it's like asphyxiating on your own, like, was it, I forgot how it was.
Yeah, so essentially the idea is you take a beam about the length of a man, and you stretch his arms out along the beam, and then take a nail and put it through the wrist bones just below the hand in each one. Then you hoist that beam up on top of another beam that's perpendicular, already wedged in the ground. And so now this man is hanging from his wrists, which are nailed to the beam. And that's painful, obviously, but you don't die from your wrist wounds. What happens is that when you're hanging that way, the way that your arms are pulling up on your chest, you can't expand your lungs to get a breath. And so you have to pull yourself up on those nails in order to take a breath. And the nail in the feet, I don't know how historical that is, but if it is, that nail is there to help you pull yourself up.
Or to prolong, maybe.
Well, yeah. Is it mercy or is it to prolong? Because there's another component of this kind of death, which is it's designed to be on public display. So the modern conception we have of a cross is like a lowercase t. The actual functional part of that death mechanism was more like a capital T. The idea of a part sticking up above the horizontal beam, my understanding is that the only reason we have an idea of that visually is that they would put a sign up on top that would have the victim's name and crimes committed.
Yeah.
So it was meant to be the equivalent of a head on a pike. Like, we're showing this off to those who should be warned of what this person did. But that person would spend several days hanging that way, trying desperately to breathe, and eventually asphyxiate after a number of days, in complete agony and complete pain, all on public display. It's terribly brutal.
Well, also, I mean, like, what is the benefit? There's something about the exercise of government to be able to put that on display in order to sort of create an example of not to step out of line. I'm also just thinking of like Spartacus, where like just this was in the movie, but there's all these guys on crosses all the way to Rome, and basically it's just saying, do not defy us, or else this is where you'll be.
Right.
And obviously this is a movie like, I am Spartacus, and all these guys got hung on a cross. But there's something about that sort of display of power that, not only can we take your life from you, we can make it horrific, and
right.
So it's just interesting too, because I mean, even in the story of,
and make you suffer not only physically but socially while we do it.
Yeah. Because like, was it even leading up to this, you kind of have this whole story of, Pharisees coming to Jesus and proposing these questions. He would answer them forthrightly, and there always this kind of dialogue back and forth, and you kind of see this sort of jealousy or wanting to keep their positions of power. And Jesus was a sort of in the way of them being able to preserve their power. But then again, they're in a system where they have to appeal to Rome in order to get these things done. And so they appeal to the governing authorities in order to have Jesus crucified in the most horrible way. It's like, why didn't they just take him out back and beat the shit out of him and have him done with him? It's like,
right.
So that there's all these like questions you have in this, but then you kind of see that the power structures that are kind of, that people are afraid to sort of, I don't know what I'm trying to say here.
Well, maybe I'll take that and segue with it a bit. It wasn't, this is another really interesting part of the story, is it wasn't exactly Pontius Pilate who wanted to kill Jesus.
No.
It was the mob.
Yeah.
It was the crowd. It was the people. I mean, he was even reluctant about it.
Yeah, and specifically the elders of the synagogue.
Right. And so I don't want this to be a theological discussion. I want this to be conceptual, because the whole idea of Easter is strange to me. And this story of Jesus and the death and resurrection is strange. And after really thinking about it, I think there's some pieces to that story that aren't talked about. So you say the Catholic Church focuses on the death, the Protestant Church focuses on the resurrection.
Generally speaking, yeah.
Right. But something that no one ever talks about is, how would I put this? It wasn't that he died, or even that he rose. I mean, it is those things, but it's, we killed him. Like, if you think about this conceptually, there is God. And whether you believe in God or not, just put that question aside for the moment and say, well, if there is a God, what is this story telling us? And in that context, there is God and then there is man. God comes to earth. So man has this question, let's say, is there a God? Is God real? And in response, God comes and says, here I am. Yes, I am real. And what does man do? He hangs him up on a cross. Humiliates him, mutilates him, betrays him, abandons him, subjects him to the highest, most brutal form of torture conceived of through history. That's astounding. And as I thought about that, I thought that's got to be important. Otherwise, it wouldn't have stayed in the story.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's really important that you said, like, we killed him, because I think there's something essential that we have to recognize in ourselves. Like, we are, if you can't see that aspect of you, that you are the one who crucified Jesus in this sense, then you don't know yourself very well. Because it's like you hear different people's take on this as far as like, oh, it was the Jews' fault, or it was the Romans' fault, or it's like no, they symbolize something that's inside of us.
Yeah, I mean, I would appeal to Solzhenitsyn's realization when trying to figure out what went wrong in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And he wrote tomes about it, and finally concluded that he had to consider how he was complicit. And ultimately, his famous line is, the line between good and evil is drawn straight through the heart of every man. And so there's this, let me see if I can make sense of this. So if I take for granted that there is a question of whether or not God is real, and maybe you've answered that for yourself. Maybe you say, well, I'm a Christian, I believe God is real, or I'm an atheist, I think it's nonsense bullshit. Doesn't matter.
Yeah.
If there's anything in you, and I think essentially most of the pursuit of humanity is ultimately trying to answer that question. Is there such a thing as a God? Is God real? All other questions are nested within that suspicion. And, okay, well, if he is real, then I'm separated from him. And what separates me? It's strange to me that the idea of Christ seems like a singular figure in history and among religions. And correct me here in ways that I know you know to correct me, but there aren't other characters that I can think of who are presented as perfect. Like in any story, anywhere.
No.
And somehow that doesn't surprise us. Like, oh no, Christ was the perfect man.
Yeah, because I mean, even when you have the Greek gods, it's like there was a sort of fallibility. So it's almost, maybe even hubris of Christianity, and sort of like, and again, you start getting into questions of like, well, how can a God be man, and is he perfect? Does he stub his toe? And there's all these weird questions that start to kind of come around this idea.
For the moment, I just want to focus on the fact that he's the only character in any of all of storytelling which is presented as perfect. That's strange in and of itself.
Yeah.
The fact that is the case means that we all inherently know that we are not perfect. So much so that we don't even try to write stories in
That's
which
true.
characters are perfect.
Yeah.
It's not interesting. We're not perfect.
Oh wow, okay. I see where we're going with it. There's something really fascinating with this. Is like, how can you even make a story of a perfect like person coming to the world as God? Because you would imagine I think I'm kind of connecting to something like, you'd almost write that story as sort of like, oh wow, God came down here and he said, hey guys, look at all these things, and we go, oh my gosh, you're so right, and then everyone starts holding hands and singing and kumbaya. It's like, but here's a story of like God coming and we kill him. It's like, or we're fighting him at every sort of, I think that's more representative of the human condition, is like, we're always fighting, whether it, I just think in my own life, whether it was my parents or, ways I thought things should be, and later learned that they were different than what I thought.
Yeah.
And there's something you and I talk about, how reality always snaps back. It's like, no matter how much you want to believe something is different, at some point reality is going to, get in your face and say, no, that's not how it is. Like, you can't jump into front of a car and say, you're not going to hurt me. The car's going to run you over. There's certain things that's just true. And I think something about this, kind of represents that idea of there's something in all of us that if God did come, we would probably kill him. if we're faced with a truth that was so revealing of our inner being, that's something that you'd either react by wanting to kill him or submitting. Maybe that's too extreme.
So no, I don't think it's extreme. And that's exactly where I'm trying to go.
Okay, gotcha.
Because there is a problem. There's a problem with existence.
Mm-hmm.
And that problem is you have the ability to imagine things as better than they are. And why? Why is that?
Mm-hmm.
You almost can't help it. Like, what if I were stronger? What if I didn't succumb to sickness? What if my relationships were more fulfilling? What if I had more money? What if I had less problems? What if I had more responsibility? What if I was smarter? What if I learned more? What if I actually started that business I've been thinking about, or wrote down, or actually wrote the essay I imagined to write, or the song I imagined to sing, or the podcast that I wanted to start? Did I say that one already? We scotch me a little bit.
Yeah. Well.
We are hounded by thoughts like these. And what percentage of those things that we imagine doing does any one of us actually do? So there's this vast space between who we know we could be and who we are. And I love, because I want to bring this back to the idea of redemption. Well, and the question is redemption from what?
Mm-hmm.
Redemption from sin. And I think the childhood idea of what sin is something like, well, you listened to 9 Inch Nails on CD, and so we probably have to have a CD burning ceremony to, whatever, or like,
yeah, or you were not.
But
nice to your brother.
I think sin is more properly characterized with this term. What is it? Hamartia, which is a Greek archery term, which means to miss the mark,
mm-hmm.
which means you're attempting to do something that has a goal and a target, and you miss. It isn't malevolence necessarily. It's failure to be who you were supposed to be. That's sin. That's to miss the mark. And go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just more because I think one confusing thing is like, what does it mean to be who you're supposed to be? I think that's something that can be kind of a little bit confusing, because it kind of sounds like there's like there's this.
Let me replace that then, because I was trying to set that up, and I said to be who you could be.
Could be, okay, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Rather than supposed to.
Gotcha. Sorry.
So I'll leave intent out of it, at least for the moment. Now, I would say that you've heard the term, there are sins of omission and sins of commission.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe in this framework, a sin of omission is like, well, I had a song to write and I didn't do it.
Mm-hmm. Or
I could have told my wife what I really thought about what she was doing, but I didn't, because I just didn't want it to be hard.
Mm-hmm.
I knew the truth, but I didn't speak it. And there's also sins of commission, which could be more properly characterized as malevolence. Like the great atrocities of the 20th century are a great example. Like it wasn't a sin of omission that caused the Germans to gas 6 million people. And it wasn't a sin of omission that caused the Soviets to starve 40 million people, right? And I think actually those sins of commission are a response to the disappointment and anger that we feel that we aren't who we know we could be. And it occurred to me that this is exactly the first story of real men in the Bible, which is Cain and Abel.
Oh, interesting. Okay, that's what you're saying.
Cain's sin of commission, the first murder, was revenge. And Cain's revenge wasn't on Abel. It was on himself, because he wasn't who he knew he could be. And he saw Abel and he saw who he could be, but he wasn't that. So he took revenge on himself by killing his brother.
Oh, I see.
And so in this story of Christ and Easter, whatever you make of it, truth or not, I think it's an interesting construct through which to think about things. if the question exists, is God real? The next question is, well, I'm not him, and what's keeping me from being him? This idea of sin.
Mm-hmm.
Then the next question is, well, how deep does sin go? Is it that I'm just not who I could be, or is it that I'm actively taking revenge on who I could be and making something else worse? And how much worse? You know, people murder other people out of hate, but they also murder other people out of love, jealousy. People murder strangers, but they also murder their spouses. And if you look at humanity as a whole, and again take this idea of God comes to man and says, here I am, here I'm real. And if you take it for granted that mankind is sinful, then the next question is, well, how sinful? And if the idea of Christ and the death and resurrection is to redeem the world, well, like, how much is God needing to redeem? And the ultimate question or the ultimate answer, I guess, to the question, well, how deep does sin go? To what extent will you take your revenge? Will you kill your family? Will you kill your community? Will you kill your country? Will you kill God himself?
You're killing me, man. You've got me going so many different directions right now. Like, because there's this part, like, because I think, you know, to really understand, I think what you're saying is, like, you really have to look at this more through the archetypes of how these things exist in us, and how we've acted these things out throughout history. You know, these stories are telling something that's how us humans have acted these things out over thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And I think that's the part that as you're like laying out this whole story, that I'm really starting to see how we've really struggled with this, is when we start seeing how that we are deficient of who we could be. Because anybody who's in a relationship knows that they are lacking in some way, you know. And again, and there's a certain part where you are asking for your spouse or your friend or whatever to give you grace, or to forgive you, or to give you room to maybe one day become that person, or get closer to that person.
Right.
And so, or you can kind of go the other way, where you're more vengeful, and that, you know, fuck you, I'm going to be who I want to be and how I want to be, and I don't care what any of you think. And there's that, I mean, being a little bit more extreme, but there's a sort of a spectrum of those sort of, like, I want to achieve the person, to be the person I think I could be. And that's like that, and you'll never reach that goal technically. And again, that's the idea of heaven, is you reach the goal, but that's sort of thing. But in reality, in the world in which you live, you're never actually going to be everything that you could be. However, the other place is so horrific that if you fight against that pursuit to be who you could be, that actually leads you into a place of almost vengeful, or a Cain type place, where you take vengeance against that who you could be. And like, you hear people say, like, fuck you, I didn't ask to be born, you know. It's like, what do you do with that? Like, that's not the response you have to life, and to kind of what you could be, because then that's something that you don't have anything at that point.
Yeah.
And also, in this point, Nietzsche always kind of starts to kind of come into the back of my head, as far as, like, you know, the death of God is like, now what do we do? And I think there's something in that is represented as, like, if you kill God, if you kill the person who you could be, and there's something you're measuring that against, because when you say I could be, there's something to be measured, something to aim at and to miss. And
but
I think
if you kill the target,
you kill a target. Like, if you kill God, if you kill the target,
then what do you have the bow and arrow for?
Yeah, what are you aiming at? Because that's the whole idea behind God, is like you're aiming at something, and
the ideal.
The ideal. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and then when there's an ideal that you're not living up to, like Jordan Peterson likes to say that the moment you have an ideal, you also have a judge.
True, yeah.
The ideal judges you because it's different than you.
Mm-hmm.
It's the thing that you're measured against. And if you kill the thing you're measured against, then you can't be measured at all. And then what? That's nihilism. That's loss.
Mm-hmm.
That's dissociation. You're no longer essentially functionally human at that point, because it is the creative act toward what could be that I think constitutes what it means to be human.
Mm.
So I do want to try to tie up a couple of loose ends from these thoughts about Easter.
Mm.
Given the question, I think we sort of ended on there for a second, which is, well, how deep does sin go? And if the idea is that story is about God offering redemption to man, then the question from man to God should be something like, well, you're going to redeem me from my sin. How much sin? I don't even know what I'm capable of.
Mm-hmm.
How much? And it isn't enough for God to say, oh, all of it. What do you mean all of it? Like, I don't even know the depths of my own heart. I don't know how deep that goes. How can I trust redemption where I don't know what the bottom is? And essentially, the story of Easter, the story of Christ, is the bottom. Could there be anything more sinful than killing God himself? Killing the ideal. That's what we're talking about. Can you miss the mark any more than destroying the target and having nothing to shoot at? Now everything is a sin. Everything is a miss. There's nothing to aim at. And you might be able to propose conceptually some idea like, oh, redemption of all sin. But how do I know that I would even do it? I mean, we all like to think, well, we would never have participated in World War II Nazi guards. We would never have participated in the Soviet Union gulags. We never would have participated in the Red Guard, Maoist China. We never would have, we think we're different, right? So God basically says, okay, I'm going to prove it. I'm going to come and tell you I'm real, and I know exactly what you're going to do. And I'm going to let you do it so that you know where the bottom is. And you know that I will redeem all of it. And then for a long time I thought, okay, the story of Christ is presented as he's the sacrificial lamb. The idea that it was the sacrifice in which the redemption occurred. But there's a problem with that. Because if you can kill God, he isn't really a God. Because what kind of God can be killed by a mortal?
Yeah.
So he makes himself man. He makes himself part of himself man. And, this is sort of leaving aside complicated subjects like the Holy Trinity or whatever. But, okay, God becomes man. We kill him. And then he says, okay, got that out of your system? I'm back. Now you know what you're capable of. Now you know what I'm offering you. And it just occurred to me that this deep and nasty story, it had to be the most tragic story of all time, and it had to be at the hands of man. Because if it wasn't, man would not know what he was capable of in the negative to know what redemption even meant. And it seems like there's an element of that story conceptually in which the full man is fully revealed and God is fully revealed. All of the Old Testament God is presented as symbols, a burning bush, the back of a shoulder, something. Now here he is, God, flesh and blood. Now here is man, designer of suffering. And now what? God says, I beat it.
Mm-hmm.
And I rose. And that's the sunshine at the end of the story. That's the moral. And I don't know if that, like, when I think about it that way, I think, well, if you are struggling with the question of, is there a God? I cannot think of a more compelling answer to that question than the story of the death and resurrection of Christ. But it only occurred to me 3 years ago. And I just wonder, why does Christendom, granted I haven't been in that for 20 years, but why do they not take that story more seriously? It's an astounding story.
Man, I hate to kind of take away from the gravitas of what you're talking about, but it does make sense to me in a way, because when you almost symbolize something too far away from the blood, sweat, and tears of it, almost like the evolutionary aspect of what it means to be human and what we're capable of, and even just this whole profound mystery of we're these animals, but at the same time we have something that's different. There's a consciousness that we have, and we're able to communicate and discuss and come to the shores and realize that we fall short of something, and we all know we don't know what we fall short of, and I think that's something that when we look at that, and you look at through history and mankind's struggle with that idea of like, I am falling short of something, and this sort of discovery, and then, you see that sort of compression of time that I think you see with the time of Adam to the time of Abraham, like that compression of time covers so much of that growth of humanity over probably millions of years of struggling with those sort of questions, and then coming to this place of like recognizing there's something more, like I could be more, there's something out there. And that sort of, I think that kind of contributes to our awareness and consciousness, and has, just evolutionary speaking, just sort of added to that differentiation from just regular animals and stuff. But I think that's, I kind of went too far on a tangent there, but I think there's something that we do have to recognize, that there's something that we do fall short of, and we can't explain that. And sometimes we try to mask over that, and we try to maybe even distract ourselves with things. But that's always sitting in the back of our consciousness. And I think that's where, stories like this unlock that part of us. Because it's like, even though if you're distracted by all the things, then you're going to just follow kind of whatever's in front of you.
Well, and maybe that's the whole impetus for talking about this, is I feel like traditionally the story of Easter has not unlocked that for me. Like, it hasn't made me aware of my own consciousness, my own creative capacity, my own potential. And I think that's the point of the story.
Like, you saying it hasn't unlocked it now, or just like whenever 3 years ago when that kind of made more sense to you? It felt like
up until it made more sense to me.
Oh, gotcha. Mm-hmm.
And then it seems to me like the most hallelujah story that there is. It's like, oh no, you could be who you could be.
Mm-hmm.
As a matter of fact, you will be. I don't know. It's such a big concept. My mind's getting tired from even just trying to relate my thoughts on it.
I really love this. I mean, I feel like just like stumbling around this area, because like there's certain things I can definitely like kind of pin down. Is like, one is, you know, the idea that there's somebody that I could be that I know I'm not. Like, to me, that's pretty certain. And then I've also seen times in my life where I just don't care.
Yeah.
Like, I don't care what things could be. I just don't care.
We are human after all. We need to sleep.
Totally. Well, I mean, you know, you see that too with
need
other
to give up sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Or you see people that are actually accomplishing something, and there's that jealousy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's something that.
Well, and that's a valid response to jealousy too, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm just not going to care for a bit.
Mm-hmm.
It's too hard to engage in because I'm not good yet,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm too upset by seeing people who are good.
Yeah.
That's kind of the social media effect.
Mm-hmm.
You're just seeing people who are good constantly.
Mm-hmm.
When really you just need to sit down and be a beginner.
Mm-hmm.
Sit down and revel in the wonder of learning. It's an incredible experience. It's much more exciting to learn than it is to perform.
Mm. Well, I think the other part that's very certain to me too is like, especially when you said like we killed Jesus, we killed God, and Nietzsche is talking about, you know, God is dead. I think there's something very important in that part to see and recognize in me. And like, there's a part of me that wants to kill that ideal.
Mm-hmm.
And it wants to kill the mark, because I know that if I aim at this mark, I'm going to fail.
To some degree.
And so I don't want any.
Because you are not God.
I'm not God, and I don't want anything to make that apparent to me.
Right.
Because that will make me feel bad.
You'd rather remain ignorant.
Or everything's subjective and it doesn't really matter. Everyone thinks whatever they want to. Truth is arbitrary, and so then it doesn't matter because there is no real mark, and so I don't feel bad because I'm not measuring myself to anything. Even if I'm measuring myself to something that's not, you know, not close to what actually is, you know, it's like any sort of measurement at all.
In classic form, I want to put a pin in this and pick it back up because I want to now talk about modern culture and measurement in general and how we're handling that situation. But I think we ought to wrap this one.
Yeah, we're all over the place with this one. It's just fun.
Well, kind of in one place, but that one place is a topic which explodes into all topics, and those are good topics.
Well, I mean,
whether you're religious or not.
Exactly. Is there anything that you want to kind of conclude with? I mean, I think what you brought, I mean, you definitely made me think about a lot of stuff and like opened up a lot of things I'm really excited to dig into some more. So.
I don't have anything particularly profound or inspiring to say at the end here.
Say something really profound, please. As my island of knowledge expands.
So too do the shores of my ignorance. And he is risen.
All right.
Cheers.
Cheers. Love you guys.
Love you out there. Thanks for listening and
definitely
watching.
Yeah, watch on Spotify.
I'm going to point to you.
You too. All right, guys. Love y'all.
Good night.